The fluorescent lights of the gas station hummed as I stood behind the counter, absent-mindedly scanning the rows of snacks. It had been a slow night, with only the occasional customer drifting in and out. The chime above the door jingled, and I glanced up to see Joey shuffling in. He was a regular here, coming by almost every night on his way home from the trucking yard. I'd gotten to recognize his worn jeans, grease-stained shirt, and that black trucker hat he never took off. "Evenin', Joey," I said with a nod. He grunted in reply, his bloodshot eyes scanning the refrigerators along the back wall. I watched him grab a couple energy drinks, a bag of chips, and some beef jerky, his usual haul. When he got to the counter, he didn't make eye contact, just stared at the floor and fumbled with his wallet, pulling out a few crumpled bills. His hands were shaking. "Long day?" I asked. Joey shrugged, rubbing his face. He looked more haggard than normal, with dark circles under his eyes. I wondered if he was popping pills again. Wouldn't be the first time. "Here's your change," I said, handing him some coins. Joey blinked slowly a few times, like he was having trouble focusing. Then he turned and shuffled out without a word, leaving one of his energy drinks on the counter. The next night went the same way. Joey came in looking spaced out, gathered an armful of snacks in silence, paid without making eye contact. He left an energy drink behind again. I called out to him as the door chimed shut, but he didn't turn around. Over the next week, Joey didn't show up at all. I found myself watching the door each night, wondering if he'd come in with that familiar shuffle. But the days passed without a sign of him. Then, 8 days later, the chime rang out, and I looked up to see Joey. He had the same haggard appearance, but his eyes were clearer somehow. They met mine, and he gave a little nod. "Haven't seen you in a while," I said as he walked up to the counter. "Yeah, been out of town for work," he muttered, picking out a few items. When he set them down to pay, he looked me in the eye again. "Thanks," he said hoarsely. I paused. "For what?" "Just, thanks." He grabbed his bag and turned to leave. As he reached the door, it swung open, the chime clattering violently. 2 men strode in, while another 2 lingered outside near a black SUV. Before I could react, they grabbed Joey roughly by the arms. "Hey, what the hell?" I shouted, rushing toward them. One of the men whipped around, glaring at me. "Back off. This don't concern you." They dragged a struggling Joey out the door. I watched helplessly through the window as they forced him into the SUV and sped off, tires squealing. The gas station seemed eerily quiet after that. I never saw Joey again. Turns out the truck he always drove wasn't even his, and that, thanks, was the first time I'd ever heard him speak directly to me. Sometimes I wonder what really happened that night. But the chiming of the door always stirs an uneasy feeling, like I'm still waiting for him to shuffle in. The tires of my sedan crunched along the gravel as I pulled into the dimly lit gas station. It was nearly midnight, and this dusty old station on the outskirts of town was the only place still open. I had been driving for hours through the rural backroads on my way to cover a story in the next state, and the fuel tank was nearing empty. I shifted the car into park and stepped out, stretching my weary limbs. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with its rusty old pumps and flickering fluorescent lights that cast an eerie glow over the lot. The radio had started acting strange about a mile back, the modern pop songs dissolving into static, and what sounded like an old crackling ballad from decades past. I shrugged it off, assuming the late hour meant I was picking up signals from some retro radio broadcast. As I pumped the gas, I noticed the prices advertised on the ancient signage were absurdly low, maybe 30 cents a gallon. I chuckled, imagining filling up for mere pocket change like my grandparents used to describe. Inside, the station was just as outdated, lined with metal shelves stocked with dusty old bottles and cans. The newspaper and magazine racks held publications from the 1950s, headlines blaring about political scandals and Hollywood gossip from another era. "Evening," grunted the clerk behind the counter in a gravelly voice. He looked straight out of a history book, with his slicked hair, white t-shirt, and cigarette dangling from his lips. I set my sodas and snacks on the counter, catching a glimpse of his name tag, Herb. Herb punched a few buttons on the chunky old register and told me my total $1.25. I paused, certain that couldn't be right given the sky-high gas prices these days. But the ancient pumps outside seemed to be advertising accurate rates. I handed Herb exact change and decided not to question it. As I turned to leave, a yellowed newspaper on the counter caught my eye. The date read, September 13th, 1958. My heartbeat quickened as I read the headline, "Fire at Buchanan Gas Station Kills 5." I scanned the article in disbelief, learning that a devastating blaze had destroyed this very station decades ago. Employees and customers had lost their lives, trapped by the flames. I stumbled back outside, looking around anxiously as if I expected to see the place engulfed. Then I spotted him. An antique car, a shiny black sedan that looked straight from the 1950s, sat at the opposite pump. The man pumping gas wore a suit and hat from that era too. My hands shook as he turned and caught my gaze, his face deathly pale. "You shouldn't be here," he said in an ominous, echoing tone. "It's not safe for you here." I scrambled to my car, throwing open the door and peeling out onto the rural highway. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I tore down the road, not daring to look back. I flew through the night, my heart pounding, until I came upon a motel and swerved into the lot. The tired-looking clerk raised an eyebrow as I demanded answers about the old station. "There hasn't been a gas station out that way since the big fire in 1958, he explained. "Burned right to the ground with poor folks trapped inside. Some nights folks say you can hear this old song playing where the place stood, like a ghostly memory." As I lay awake that night shivering in the motel bed, the reality of what I had experienced sank in. Somehow, for a brief spell tonight, I had found myself decades in the past. I had stood on ground where people had met their end, witnessed that fatal night through a thin veil separating then and now. Some places and events leave stains on the fabric of time itself, echoes that reverberate forward, reminding the living of a past that refuses to fully die. Whether as ghosts, visions, or warnings, the dead still have messages for those open enough to hear them. The first rays of dawn cast an eerie glow over the sprawling gas station as I pulled up to the pumps. Situated at a remote highway junction, the station was an oasis of light in the surrounding darkness. My eyes were gritty from a night of driving, and I hoped a quick stop here would energize me for the road ahead. I stepped out into the chilly morning air, stretching my stiff limbs. Despite the early hour, the station was bustling with activity. The parking lot was dotted with vehicles fueling up, while crowds milled around the adjoining convenience store. Across from my pump, a rowdy group of teenagers were crammed into an old van, laughing and joking as they filled their tank. One of them had a camera out and was trying to corral the others into photos. Their loud voices grated on my frayed nerves. After fueling up, I headed into the store to grab some snacks. Pushing through the glass doors, I was met with a blast of warm air that carried the scents of fresh brewed coffee and sugary pastries. Despite the packed parking lot, the store itself was oddly quiet, with only a lone cashier standing at the counter, scrolling on her phone. The aisles were empty, save for a few other bleary-eyed travelers seeking road trip provisions. As I wandered the aisles gathering supplies, a fragment of muffled conversation from the back room caught my attention. "Make sure she doesn't leave," a gruff voice muttered. I froze, a chill creeping down my spine despite the warm air. Glancing around, it seemed no one else had noticed the ominous words. The other shoppers remained focused on their tasks, while pop music continued piping weakly through the overhead speakers. After a moment, I shook my head and grabbed a few more snacks, chalking it up to tired ears playing tricks on me. I brought my pile of road trip junk food to the counter to pay. As the cashier rang up my items, the group of rowdy teenagers from earlier barged into the store. Their voices echoed off the walls as they laughed and joked with each other. I kept my eyes down, hoping they would move on quickly. "Hey!" One of the boys blocked my path as I turned to leave. "Come take a group photo with us before you go." His smile seemed friendly enough, but something in his tone put me on edge. "No thanks. I should really get back on the road," I replied evenly, trying to step around the teenager. He sidestepped with me, his tall frame blocking my exit. "Come on, it'll only take a second. Don't you want a selfie to remember your road trip?" As he pressed closer, I noticed his friends turning our way, their attention captured by the exchange. My heart started to hammer in my chest. "Please, I need to get going," I insisted. Aware my voice was pitched higher in growing panic, the teenager's face flashed with annoyance for a moment before his smile returned, this time with a hard edge. "Don't be rude, I just want a quick picture." He grabbed my wrist, causing me to gasp. My eyes darted wildly around the store, desperate for aid. Near the entrance, a uniformed security guard watched the escalating situation with a detached expression. I locked eyes with him pleadingly, hoping he would intervene, but he merely sipped his coffee disinterestedly. Just as the vise-like grip on my wrist started to ache, the glass doors banged open. A trucker stormed in, face red and shouting, "Hey, someone slashed my tires out there! Which one of you punks did it?" The angry accusation distracted my tormentors for a split second. I wrenched my arm from the teenager's grasp and bolted for the doors. Bursting into the parking lot, I sprinted for my car, fumbling with the keys. I could hear angry shouts behind me as the group realized I was escaping. Tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot at breakneck speed. I caught a glimpse of the teenagers pouring out of the store in pursuit just before I turned onto the highway. Gripping the wheel with white knuckles, I pressed harder on the gas, putting distance between me and the now terrifying station. After several adrenaline-fueled miles, I pulled over on the deserted highway to catch my breath. Glancing back to ensure I wasn't followed, my heart pounded as the reality of the close call sunk in. Hands shaking, I called the local police and tried to explain what had happened. The officer who answered the phone sounded grim. "You're lucky you got away safely," he said gravely. "We've received multiple troubling reports about that gas station from solo female travelers like yourself. There is strong suspicion the teenagers who frequent it are part of a human trafficking ring targeting vulnerable people." I shuddered at the implication, bile rising in my throat as I imagined what could have happened if that trucker hadn't burst in when he did. After thanking the officer profusely, I decided to stick to more populated routes and gas stations for the remainder of my trip, no longer daring to stop at isolated outposts along the lonely highways. I tried to shake the lingering sense of unease, grateful to have escaped with my freedom intact. But the sinister encounter would haunt my thoughts each time I pulled over to fill up on those endless open roads.